Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Green Disruptors Scaling the Future. I'm your host, Megan Kjar, and today I'm thrilled to be speaking with Will Glazener, co-founder of Terralytiq. Will's background spans from leading McKinsey's decarbonization practice to launching his own climate tech startup in Austin, Texas, a city that's not just known for live music, but also as a crossroads for the global energy transition. Together, we'll unpack how Terralytiq is helping the world's largest manufacturers tackle supply chain emissions and why decarbonization needs to come before measurement, and how focusing on the biggest hotspots like aluminum smelters can cascade into real impact. So let's do this. Hello. I'm excited to have Will Glazener on with me, co-founder of Terralytiq. How's it going, Will?
Thanks for having me, Megan. It's going really well.
Yeah, tell us where you are, first of all, in the
Yeah,
world.
so I'm located in Austin, Texas, my hometown, but also the crossroads of the energy transition, given how
Yeah.
many renewables we're putting down in Texas. So great town, not just for live music, but also for energy transition.
Ooh, we could talk about live music for a while,
We
but we'll
could.
dive right in. So tell us, first of all, what Terralytiq is, and then what is your personal connection that led you to launching it?
Sure. So Terralytiq is in the business of supply chain decarbonization. So we are a software climate tech startup that I founded about 2 years ago with my co-founder, Alex Pfeiffer. And what we do is we help the world's largest manufacturers reduce the carbon emissions in their supply chain. The way we look at it, industrials can be the force multiplier for decarbonization because as a sector, they're about 20 gigatons of emissions, is about a third of all global emissions. And from any one company's perspective, 70 to 90% of those emissions are upstream in the supply chain. And
Right,
so if
so
they
they
can just
don't even feel
cascade,
like they have control over it.
exactly, which is a myth. They definitely do because they sit at the end and have influence as a large integrated customer over what happens upstream. But it is a challenge. It's much more challenging than their own scope one and two emissions.
Yeah. So back up just a little bit and tell me, like, yeah, how did you decide to go into this? What led to that for you personally?
Yeah, it's really easy to connect the dots looking backwards. If you asked me this 10 years ago, where will you be?
Hindsight
I'd have
2020.
exactly. What I was doing right before Terralytiq, I was an associate partner at McKinsey. I was leading their decarbonization practice for the North America region, which meant that I had a large team of about 4 consultants helping big companies with their climate strategies across sectors from financial to manufacturing to energy, do things like set targets, create roadmaps, implement some of those strategies. And I got into that because McKinsey is a really large consultancy advising large companies on big challenges. And I said, well, emissions are largely a business problem. Businesses are the
Hmm.
biggest source of emissions. So if I'm working at an advisory firm for the largest companies, this is a really good platform for impact on emissions, is to help then those businesses with emissions. So that's what got me into the work. Within that, we work from a few different points of leverage to try to kickstart this transition to a zero carbon economy. And supply chain projects seem to have the most impact because you could work with these large integrated manufacturers that had influence over supply chains. And if they just cascade one good solution through the supply chain, that will have a massive impact on emissions. And so that was then the inception of Terralytiq from this is a really big opportunity for impact. We also looked at what was happening in the market with carbon software and noticed that we thought many people were approaching the problem backwards. So therefore they were building the solutions and products backwards. And that was extra motivation for us to start Terralytiq and wind up here today.
Sounds like it's very values driven for you. Like from the get-go, you've wanted to just do something that makes the biggest impact possible.
Absolutely. I guess at a personal level, a few years ago, I thought, well, if I'm going to have to spend this much time of my life at work, it better be
Yeah,
something that I care about.
no kidding.
But then, broader than just myself, the one condition that allowed human civilization to prosper is a stable climate. And now we've left the safe operating zone. And so now I think there's just an obligation, but also a tremendous opportunity for prosperity for all to get back to the safe operating zone, a stable climate. And the best way to do that is to reduce emissions at speed and scale.
Yeah, I love that. So let's go back to what you said a second ago about how a lot of other software companies are trying to solve the problem backwards. To explain that
Yes,
to me.
I think the story of decarbonization is a transition and just trying to put a foot forward. But sometimes the first foot forward isn't the best foot forward. I think what we saw was And this is sustainability practitioners at these big companies and the solution providers alike. We're thinking about measurement as the journey and then decarbonization as the outcome. So if you measure enough, you'll then get to decarbonize. And we said it's actually the opposite of that. If you decarbonize enough, then you can measure the impact of those actions. And so measurement isn't the leading indicator of action, it's the lagging indicator of impact and action. So we built Terralytiq from a problem statement that said, what does a software platform look like that is built for and designed for emissions reduction, not emissions measurement?
It's not just a data tracker.
That's right. And it kind of sounds unsatisfying and underwhelming to say, well, measurement's the outcome. But that truly is the case because we succeed when we measure emissions and they equal zero. So the role for software platforms is really to help users decarbonize, not measure. So that's the philosophy behind what we've built and how we've created a white space for our tool with customers that see the same pathway we do to impact.
So how does that work in terms of somebody comes on and uses it? Does it immediately say this is the first thing you need to fix? Or like, yeah, tell me an example of a customer journey there.
Yeah, I'm probably undercutting our platform, but they only have to use the platform to say the number one thing you can do is have your suppliers adopt renewable electricity. For almost every company in the world,
Yeah.
that could get you to your 2030 decarbonization targets before you have to worry about anything else. So in some cases, I advocate like don't use our platform at all. If you really want to focus on emission reduction, just build a renewable electricity program and that'll get you there. But it can be a bit more complex than that. So yeah, the way it works, our customers are large manufacturers. So original equipment manufacturers, OEMs across automotive, construction, industrial machinery, and their largest suppliers.
Are these people only in the US or is it global?
It's global.
Okay.
Generally, the mix is they are either headquartered in Europe or North America, but given the trends of globalization, their tier one suppliers are all over the world, and a large share of them are in Asia. So our customer base, I'd say, are multinationals headquartered in Europe and North America. But since we work at the interface between them and their suppliers, our work takes us all over the world.
Very cool.
So the way we start with them is we look at what these large manufacturers are buying from their suppliers. So housings, compressors, heat exchangers, bearings, all of these industrial components that make up the equipment that we might recognize like cars, washing machines, compressors. And we give them the product carbon footprint, which says, here's how many emissions were released when in the making of this product. So that the time it arrives to you, this is the accumulated emissions in the supply chain. And we do this in a way that makes us unique. We're able to break down that supply chain into every single tier. We're able to actually map out the full supply chain behind it and break down those emissions into each facility so we can identify what the hotspots are. Because even though the solution is probably still deploy renewable electricity, we can actually focus them on what's the hotspots that matter. And that's something I think a lot of companies struggle with is not knowing where in the supply chain are those opportunities for focused impact. And so we help them get there.
So the goal is to do the thing first that will have the biggest impact.
Exactly.
It's like when you're paying down a debt, you pay the one with the highest interest first. It's kind of the same
Exactly.
concept.
Exactly. I think every single sustainability team will tell you they're vastly under-resourced. And so when you're in a resource-constrained environment and you literally cannot do everything, you have to do the things that matter most. So we help guide them to those hotspots.
So when, like, let's say you identify what the hotspot is, do you then have a way of connecting them with solutions, or is it just like, go find XYZ?
Yeah, there's kind of two steps to it. The first one is kind of an innate desire from companies to make sure there's enough accuracy in the measurement to act with conviction. I think the kind of initial methods of measurement had folks feeling a bit burned because they were rough approximations. They were a first foot forward, but they weren't the best foot forward. So actually, the first step is engaging suppliers around the baseline. And so kind of coming back to our approach of what does a software platform look like that reduces emissions, not measures them. We said, well, what if we just give them the measurement up front? We don't have to ask the suppliers for it. We can tell them what the measurement is. And that first engagement with suppliers is a really collaborative, efficient method of confirming our outside-in measurement. So that's step one. We put our product carbon footprint, our PCF, in front of the supplier, open book, full transparency, and say, here's the PCF that we've calculated outside in. We've got all these fancy AI tools that can map out supply chains, use trade data. Ultimately, it's an estimate. It's a really good estimate, but it's an estimate enough that please have a look at this and let us know if we got anything wrong about it. It's really great for suppliers that are new to sustainability because it's the first time they're seeing it and it's then a benefit to them. And for advanced suppliers, they understand that we understand their industry at a level of depth that they do as well and can engage efficiently on those hotspots. So the first step is kind of confirming that there's enough accuracy and a shared understanding of what the hotspot is. To give you an example, manufacturers across automotive, construction equipment, they'll buy machined and forged stamped aluminum parts. So like a car door or a hood or a housing that's usually made by a machine shop that might be sourcing from a distributor that's then sourcing from a primary aluminum producer. And that smelter is the hotspot. And so to go to their tier one and say, tell me what your emissions are and how you decarbonize, to a machine shop is like looking at the peanuts of the emissions and saying, where can you squeeze out some emission reduction? The hotspot's 2 tiers behind them. So approach that supplier and say, well, here's the full PCF with the hotspots. And particularly it's about the smelter. Do we have a shared understanding about where you're sourcing your ingots from, where that primary smelter is located, and what that supplier is currently doing to reduce emissions? And that creates a very collaborative environment that ultimately confirms accuracy in the emissions, but then also a shared goal on how they then reduce those. Okay. That was a long answer to the first part. The second part is then the solutions, which we can also talk about.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and tell me more about that part.
One of the advantages about decarbonization is that emissions come from these very old legacy industries that are very well understood.
Yes.
We've been making steel, aluminum, plastics the same way for a very long time. And so there's a lot of data about today's facilities and how those facilities can reduce emissions. Sustainability puts carbon emissions at the forefront, but before sustainability, there was resource efficiency, there's energy efficiency, and other types of large-scale efforts that look at how can we make materials better with less waste, less energy, lower cost. And sustainability is just a new flavor of that way of thinking. How do we still get the goods and services that we need, this time in a lower emissions way? What we're able to do with our models is actually look at what are all the decarbonization projects and solutions that are out there, demonstrated beyond a pilot scale. And we can actually model what the emissions impact is of those interventions, as well as the cost impact of those. So what we provide our customers is a library of every single tier in the supply chain. Here's a possible list of solutions that your suppliers could deploy as interventions. And then we help them normalize the discussion around cost and carbon impact. What would the product carbon footprint and unit costs be if this aluminum housing was made with renewable electricity in the smelter via power purchase agreement? And so we guide them to what those most efficient cost and carbon reduction initiatives are, and talk to their suppliers about how to deploy those within the supply chain.
Okay. So let's talk ROI and business too for a minute. So, I mean, obviously people ideally want to reduce their emissions, but if it doesn't make business sense, they won't. So what kind of conversations are you having with these potential clients of yours, and how are you demonstrating the value and the return to them?
Yeah, I have to say I have an unpopular views on this topic, which is I think sustainability unfairly gets measured up against cost. I think there's kind of an implicit assumption that companies are always choosing the lowest cost solution, and that is not the case.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it still has to make sense in the business.
It has to make sense, exactly. And so there's still a business case or a justification, but there's plenty of precedent for suppliers that have higher quality or better delivery or better service that are charging a premium for that, even if they're making the same exact product as somebody else. So the same holds for sustainability. It's not that it always needs to be lower cost. It just needs to have a justification. And there's several different ways to think about it. At a very macro long-term view, renewable electricity is lower cost than fossil energy. May not be the case right now this day because data centers and tech giants are eating up all the renewable electricity that they can. Demand well exceeds supply, and then just dynamics of economics raise prices above the actual technical cost to provide renewable electricity. But over the long term, wind and solar is free. And so that's one way of thinking, which is long-term thinking. How do we get our supply
Which
chain
humans
to a
are
lower
bad
cost
at.
state? They are bad at. And I think sustainability is really testing our ability
Yeah.
to think about and make decisions on the long term. This is where you really get to differentiate. You can see the difference between leaders and laggards, those leaders of companies that have long-term executives and C-suites that understand the direction of travel and are positioning their company to thrive over decades, not deliver just on the quarter. So that's kind of one banner item.
One side.
Renewable electricity is the feedstock is free and over the long term is cheaper. In the medium term, like we're seeing with renewable electricity prices right now, where there's a race to get it and then prices fly up, that means the late movers are paying the premium. They didn't get in early enough. And renewable electricity is not the only solution that's subject to supply and demand. Everything from electrification, heat pumps, electric resistance boilers, clean hydrogen, carbon capture, biofuels. If there is a race to secure materials produced with those solutions, the ones that get there first,
the last adopters, yeah.
The last adopters will pay the supply demand and balance premium. The very first adopters may pay a bit of like the technology cost premium of there's not enough scale and development yet to get the lowest cost possible, but that's a lot smaller than the fly up for being the late adopter. And that's on the medium term. We're talking 5 years. So you don't have to make a 30-year bet on free energy to justify decarbonizing. But that is a medium term view, which still is challenged in environments like today. So then trying to pull that horizon in even closer, the cost of decarbonization is far less than the inflation and tariffs that we're witnessing this year and the past 3 years. We're talking the cost of cars, washing machines, and final equipment is only 1% to 2% more if they're made in a zero carbon way. And we're living through inflationary times of double digits and tariffs of double to triple digits. So I think just this idea that decarbonization costs a lot relative to what's happening in the economic, it's noise.
It's kind of silly.
Yeah.
Well, and just you could go to the economic consequences of climate change are way more expensive than any of that.
Yeah. Hard to factor in because it's a game of probabilities of extremes, but
yeah,
I think what we'll likely see is the continued worsening of physical hazards, and it's not until an extreme event actually impacts a company or somebody until they then decide, oh, wait, this is actually real. It hurts my business. I need to do something about it.
Right.
On the even shorter time frame, and I'm stepping through all of this because this is kind of part of the story that sustainability and procurement need to communicate to get budget and funding to deploy these projects. There are solutions that still cut cost and carbon, and suppliers are looking for customers to signal that demand. And I think the most effective conversations we see in our work is customers that are able to communicate to suppliers, we have an emission reduction target to reduce our scope 3 emissions by 25%. We are interested in moving volume from higher carbon to lower carbon suppliers, or suppliers that can deliver emission reductions if they're high carbon today. And that movement of volume is more business for suppliers. And just saying that is enough incentive for suppliers to engage and say, like, well, here's actually some things that we can do. We're looking for a commitment to buy our material for a certain period of time to give us the financial support to make these interventions. But I think transitions are always demand-led. You can never wait on supply to say, here's what I've got. You have to start with demand saying, here's what we're looking for, who can provide. Let suppliers innovate and tell you about the solutions they've been figuring out themselves at their own facilities. And so some of those look like increased recycled content, which still has opportunity to grow. It cuts cost, it cuts carbon. There are still some places where a renewable PPA is cheaper than the grid. And there are plenty of electrification interventions, coming back to at the factory level, using heat pumps or electric resistance boilers instead of gas, coal, or diesel, where there's an upfront capital investment required to replace that equipment, but the operating cost is lower because these electric machines are much more efficient than fossil ones. For a supplier to make that investment, they need to know that you're going to buy from them for a period of time. So just entering into contracts that have longer periods of time that allow suppliers to make those initial investments into electrification and ensuring the cost benefit is a business case that pencils out now for decarbonization.
Yeah. So There's other software platforms out there that are doing things not in the same way you are, but how are you approaching scaling and helping people understand the value and getting in front of the right people?
Yeah, I think we look at the interface between our customers and their suppliers as where we can deliver the most value. So we don't want to be an internal tool that only the sustainability team
Feel like
uses. We don't
everyone
want to
needs it along the whole supply chain.
exactly. And so we think about how can we provide a fact base across cost and carbon that creates a win-win-win for sustainability and procurement and the supplier. Sustainability is accountable to deliver emissions reduction. Procurement is accountable to source most strategically, cost effectively, et cetera. Supplier needs to grow their business. And there's opportunity for all three of those parties at that interface. And platforms like ours need to think about all of those perspectives in the room. So I think us taking that perspective of there are really three parties here, and we need to support all three of them is how we think about scale. Because if we only solve for one, you eventually stall out. But if you solve for all three, there's a lot of growth.
So, from a marketing perspective, what does that look like? Because are you
Yeah.
speaking only to the big manufacturers that are headquartered in North America and Europe, or are you trying to reach everybody?
I think it starts with the companies that are at the end of supply chains. They're the ones that typically have targets for their emissions within that interim targets for the near term and more resourcing to create and implement programs for supply chain
Yeah,
decarbonization. You don't
makes
have to
sense.
go too far up the supply chain before you get to single factory suppliers in quite remote locations that just
Mm.
aren't going to have the resourcing and influence to drive full scale change. So we definitely start there where there is influence and resources to enact change.
So, what have you done to get these types of clients on board? And, like, but basically,
Yeah,
what's worked and maybe what are you stuck with right now?
yeah. Well, I think I will. The perspective I would bring to this conversation is somebody that I'm not a software and tech guy by background, and we're bringing a software solution. And so there's advice that you get as a software, like a B2B software company, that I think totally falls flat in the sustainability
Mm,
space. And there's also some approaches from the sustainability angle that are just a bit too theoretical and not practical enough to attract
yeah.
interest. And so that's kind of the end of the spectrum for our sector, and we try to um, find what works in between those. So, for example, there's an intellectualism about sustainability. It's steeped in
Absolutely.
science. There's moral rights and wrongs about sustainability that you have to not just follow but believe in to appeal and communicate with sustainability practitioners. You'll see right through it.
I mean, are they extra wary of like profiteering, like that, like they want to make sure your values aligned as well?
I think so. And going back to what I was saying about when we looked at the market before starting Terralytiq, we thought the existing solution providers had it backwards. I think they're skeptical of just another tech
Just another
or
software.
consulting provider trying to build something functional that
Mm,
is devoid of content underneath the hood. And so what that content looks like, I think fundamentally is, do you have a forward looking view on this transition? Because we are working to transition from a high carbon to a net zero state. The path between is a transition. And so you fundamentally have to have a content driven perspective about what does the transition look like? What is the best, the fastest, the most efficient, the right way to transition? And that has to come through in your marketing and the way that you approach customers is that so they see this person understands the science of climate. They understand that we're working to transition our business and they have a view on what that transition looks like. And there's different philosophies on that transition. So you'll go out there and you'll turn off customers that don't share your view of the transition, but you really will
mm.
attract those that share the same view. And so ours has always been a combined procurement sustainability approach that cascades impact through the supply chain, forgets about offsets and insets because those are proxy markets, but really like contracting through quantities, unit prices, and product carbon footprints through the supply chain. And that's how we kind of derive all of our marketing and our outreach is around that philosophy of the transition.
On just a more base level, like what kinds of strategies are you using? Like I understand the education and connection piece that you need, but like what systems are you using?
Yeah. So a lot of the systems that I think traditional software industry have used to do like mass cold email, we tried at the beginning. did not work at all,
Hmm.
thankfully, because it does feel a bit, it's not the way I normally would talk to somebody in person in real life. So sending out cold emails never felt at home to us. I think the tools that we have used today, and this is not a particular endorsement of any, I wouldn't say we did a comprehensive assessment of all the tools out there, but we've used a combination of tools that help you build a list of who your customer personas are, like LinkedIn and Apollo are two tools that we've used and looked at that help you define who your customers are based on which company they work at, their job title, their
How
previous
big it is, how
experience.
long they've been in business,
Yeah.
what the keywords are. Yeah.
And that helps you go from a statement like, we're Terralytiq, we work with manufacturers to reduce their supply chain emissions, to we work with companies like Danfoss and Bain and other manufacturers, to here's the specific people at companies that we haven't yet worked with that we want to get in touch with. And so it's helping you do that walk from
So is
what you do
it
as a
more
company
like
to
the Dream
specific.
100 approach where you're like, let's really focus on high touch conversations with these people?
Yeah, there's filtering that we do around has this company set an SBTI target, and then have they set an interim scope 3 target. But yeah, and that narrows down the pool from all manufacturers headquartered in North America and Europe to the ones that we know are investing or taking decarbonization seriously. There's in this set of tools, then how do you get in touch with folks? And I think the bias is to go with tools that help you scale, reach out to as many folks in a shorter
Mm-hmm.
period of time. But that kind of automation also isn't natural, doesn't feel human always. And so we've tried some of that. I can't remember the name of the tool that we've used, but I think ultimately we said, you know what, if we find the people that we want to get in touch with, the best thing to do is to send them a connection request and a DM on LinkedIn with who we are and why we want to talk to them. And usually we engage on a content perspective. How much primary data from your suppliers is enough before you can decarbonize? I'd love to talk to you and other practitioners like you about that. And that's genuine. We truly want to know. And we
Yeah.
don't go into those first conversations with, hey, we've got a software platform, we think you want to buy it. But engaging on that content and those perspectives is a really effective way for us to learn, to stay in touch with what our customers are experiencing daily. And then for the ones that are looking for support, to then have those conversations.
Yeah. I mean, clearly I know firsthand how well that works, but it can be challenging just because it's so time consuming. Like, how are you guys dealing with that? Like, do you have team members that can help?
Yeah, it's mostly me and my co-founder Alex who focus on that kind of outreach. Yeah, at an early stage startup scale, at some point you're just trying to go from 0 to 1. So
Totally.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's impossible to think about doing that at scale. But when you're just starting out, all you need is your first customer, and then all you
Yeah.
need is your next 5. And so
Well,
working
and
with
then you
small
can
numbers
start
helps a bit.
developing sales enablement materials that can maybe help warm up people along the process instead of you doing all of it
That's
individually
right.
with the person. Yeah, that makes sense.
Something that's
Well,
unique to
thanks. That
us.
helps me understand. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say something that's I think unique to us is our platform is used by procurement and sustainability managers and their suppliers on the other side. And so just by using our platform, we get in touch with our customers' suppliers, who can also be potential customers because
Yeah,
they then have suppliers in a
they
whole
also
supply
have
chain that sit
suppliers.
upstream of them,
Yeah,
reflecting their total business, not just their business with our customer. And so that's been another way that we've planned for growth is, well, we can reach out to customers, and then by working with us, we will be in touch with their suppliers. And there's a lot of thought and professional that has to go into that because we're genuinely trying to help our customers and their suppliers reduce emissions first. If we went into those conversations like, by the way, you can also buy our tool, they'd say, okay, get out of here, this is not honest. So it's a slower process, but it's one that their first interaction with Terralytiq is actually using our platform, and that's kind
that's
of a unique
great.
superpower. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we'll wrap it up here in a second, but I just want to know, what are you are there any special initiatives going on in the next 12 months, or what are you excited about in the coming year in the business?
That's a great question. I will say 2025 has not given us a lot to be excited about.
Oh gosh, I know.
I think for anybody working in sustainability and climate, you have to be excited about the constant slate of problems that need solving. And so kind of
Yeah.
in a weird way, you can't let the presence of problems make you feel exhausted or burnt out, that has to be a source of energy. And so I think for me, it is too, like what we're thinking about right now is in a lot of these industrial supply chains, I've talked about aluminum a lot in this, so I'll continue that. There's hundreds of thousands of small machine shops and other companies you can buy aluminum parts from. Tens, thousands. There are only 280 aluminum smelters in the world because they're big, they're expensive. It's not like everybody can have one in their backyard or in their town. Like there's a finite number of them, which makes it a tractable problem. So something I'm excited about is helping our customers aggregate demand across their tier one suppliers who are all sourcing from the same smelter to feel more empowered to talk to those large manufacturers of raw materials about how they can be decarbonized. And it's also an incentive for the operator of that large asset, because then they see and hear the demand signals from a broader customer base than just one company. And so I think thinking about how we can help the more fragmented parts of the supply chain come together and engage with the more concentrated part of the supply chain, which is usually where the hotspot of emissions are, is going to unlock a lot of emission reduction.
Well, in 280, I mean, that sounds like a solvable problem instead of, you think, you know, the millions of other places where you can make smaller impacts. It's like start with those big ones. That makes total sense.
Exactly. In most industrial supply chains have one. Aluminum smelter, iron furnace, cement kiln, steam cracker for anything polyethylene, polypropylene, petrochem related. Most supply chains have a hotspot.
Very cool.
I do not envy agricultural companies where most of their emissions are on the farm. You know, the average size of a farm is a few soccer fields, and I think 1 in every 4 people in the world is still a farm. I mean, that is a fragmented, dispersed problem to solve. But industrial has a bit more concentration where I think we can unlock impact. So even though the technical solutions might seem more difficult, and this term of hard to abate gets thrown around industry a lot, the actual sources of where those get deployed is really concentrated.
Yeah. Well, I 100% agree with what you said. It's like you have to find what your source of energy is. And I think for me to be, well, I mean, speaking of people like you who are in a business where daily you are solving these problems, it's like I'm just going to put my head down and solve the problems in front of me, and I'll let the world be crazy, but like at least I'm doing something.
Yeah, and even before the world got crazy, sustainability itself is a series of crises across water and biodiversity and carbon. And so I think always you have to have, I have definitely had the perspective of, I'm going to give it my all to solve carbon, and I'm going to trust that somebody else is going to do the same for biodiversity and water, because they're trusting me to do this for carbon. So there's a bit of take your tunnel vision on, because you can't solve all crises at once. And yes, holistic thinking and systems change do have a role, but we're in a period now where we don't need thought leadership. We need actual action. I think they're having subject matter expertise and scale to focus on specific problems is what we need. So yeah, for us, it's carbon emissions.
Okay. Well, this has been really cool, and it is cool to see the unique way that Terralytiq is approaching it. So we'll be excited to see what's going to happen and what big projects you can get in the next year. So thanks so much for letting us know who you are today.
Of course. And thanks again for having me, Megan. I love what you're doing on this series, and
thanks.
I appreciate you having me.
It is fun. I get to see all the different tunnel vision type people, and it actually is very comforting.
That's
to
right.
me.
That's right.
All right.
Yes.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
All right, that wraps up our conversation with Will and Terralytiq. We covered everything from the philosophy of decide to decarbonize first and then measure later, to the tangible ROI and long-time business advantages of a cleaner supply chain. A huge thank you to Will for sharing his insights and real-world examples of how industry leaders can drive change at speed and at scale. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most importantly, share it with somebody who cares about climate impact. Until next time, I'm Megan Kjar. Keep disrupting, keep scaling, and let's rebuild our world for a stable climate.